Hello and welcome to this short training session on how to use the Assessment of Core CBT Skills, the ACCS scale. This session focuses on a practice rating. Within this session you have the opportunity to view a video recording of a role-play treatment session. We'll then use the different items on the ACCS scale to rate the competence of the therapist providing the session and to deliver formative feedback. There are 4 key steps to using the ACCS scale, and we'll just go through each of these in turn now. The first step is to gather all of the assessment materials that you'll require. 2 key things that you'll need are the user manual and feedback form. These can both be downloaded freely from the website www.accs-scale.co.uk. The feedback form provides you with space to write notes about the aspects of competence that you'll be rating using the scale, and you can use this to deliver feedback to the therapist being rated. The user manual is also really key, and we suggest that you look through this on first use and then come back to this every now and again just to refresh your memory, as this provides details about what the different points on the scale are for each of the different items in the ACCS scale. So particularly today we'll be going through each item in turn, so we suggest that you have a copy of the user manual open with you as you go through this training workshop. Obviously another key thing that you need is the session recording that you'll be rating. Today we're going to use a role-play treatment session, so very many thanks to Jill Roberts and Helen Kennelly, who were role-playing the client and therapist in this session. They are aware that this session was recorded and is being used for training purposes, and have very kindly given their permission for us to use that today. This is a fictitious therapy session, so Jill Roberts will be playing the therapist, who we've called here Joe, and the patient is played by Helen Kennelly, who we're calling here Sarah. You'll notice on the ACCS website that we provide a submission cover sheet, and that we recommend that therapists submit a cover sheet with every session recording that is being rated using the ACCS scale. This just provides some therapeutic context for the person completing the assessment. So here we have a cover sheet for our patient. We can see that we're looking at session number 3. We've got some information about the patient's presenting problems and their treatment goals. Within the submission cover sheet we can also see a brief formulation, and here is a diagrammatic formulation that the therapist is working with the client to help understand and formulate the problem that she's presenting with. We also have information about the agenda that the therapist notes was set. We have information about the homework, so this is the homework that was reviewed from the previous session. So here we have information about what the assignments were and what the outcome of that was. Next we have the therapist's summary of the main topics, the main things that they covered during the session. We also have information about the new homework that was set to complete after this session. We have a summary about the patient's feedback on the session. And finally, we have information about any standardised questionnaires or idiosyncratic measures which were used to assess change either within the treatment or across the treatment provision. We would also recommend that the therapist submits an image of any kind of materials that were used during the session, so that the person completing the assessment can really have sight of what the therapist and the client were looking at in the session. So here we have a copy of the eating diary that the client brought in having completed for homework and that they review within the session. So the next thing is to watch the session recording and to take some notes. What we would suggest doing is watching the entire session and taking some notes throughout, and then coming back and looking at the specific items and domains afterwards to rate performance on that 4-point rating scale. This is something that will get quicker with repeated use of the scale. On first use, it does take a little more time. So now we're going to take about half an hour out to watch the session recording. So I'm going to hand you over to Jo and Sarah.
Right, hi, so welcome, Sue. How are you doing?
I'm okay, I guess. What I need to tell you straight away is I have a meeting this afternoon that I couldn't cancel. I tried. It was sprung on us this morning, so I'm only going to be able to stay for half an hour.
Right, so we've got half an hour,
Yeah.
so we can we'll keep that in mind.
Okay.
Okay. And so if we think how we're going to spend that time, I wondered if you did any thoughts about last session.
I found last session very helpful. It helped me really tease out kind of what was going on. It made a lot of sense.
Right.
But there is something that I'd very much like to talk about today.
All right. So you said that last session was helpful, helping you tease things. Is there anything that you were less happy about, or that you wanted to mention that you was uncomfortable or less helpful?
No, actually, it made me feel more comfortable than I'd expected.
Okay, thank you.
For that.
So in fact, there's something that you want us to spend time on today, and I'm also aware that I'd asked you to keep a diary.
Yeah, I've got that.
All right. So if we spend some time, perhaps looking at that,
Yeah.
and then what was it in particular you'd like us to spend time on?
Well, we'll actually see it if we go through the diary. It was at work last week. A couple of colleagues caught me mid-binge, and that's never happened in the whole of my life. That's never happened. I've always been able to conceal that side of me, and it really upset me. And I've been worrying about that ever since.
So from the diary, some colleagues came in when you were in the middle of binging, and that's the first time that's ever happened. Okay, and it's kept you quite preoccupied since then.
Yeah.
So that's something you might spend a bit of time on. Okay. Does that sound as if we go over your diary and we think about this one episode, how would that sound if that's what we spent the time on today, given that we've only half an hour?
Yeah, I think that's plenty
All right.
to get through. There are some other things, but I can save those maybe for when we next meet.
Yeah.
This is the thing that's really bugging me.
Right, so it sounds as if that would be the best thing to spend the time on today. Great, so I'm really interested to see your diary, and also I know that you had reservations there about keeping it, and I just wondered how it was to do that, to do the recording.
I've got very mixed feelings about it. When I on the first day, as you can see, I was very good, and I didn't binge at all, but ate very sensibly. And that day I thought the food diary was helping, because it made me so conscious of what I was doing and structuring my eating, and I knew I'd have to write it down, and I thought, oh, this is great, this is what's going to make the difference.
Right.
And then the next day started out okay, but it all went wrong because that was the day when the colleagues caught me binging, and then when I went back to the diary to fill in what had happened, I found it quite distressing to have to go back over what I'd done.
Okay.
And I also found it difficult to remember just what I'd eaten because it's all a blur.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it's accurate. And then since then, I've hardly eaten anything really. I'm really trying to make up for that binge, and I'm just so upset really by these colleagues seeing me.
So if I can just check that I've picked you up properly, Sarah, because you were saying the first day your view was that this was very good and it meant that you were structured and you were eating as you wanted to, and you thought, oh, this is great.
I thought we'd cracked it. I thought that was it.
So a real sense of, gosh, a relief there.
Yeah, I'm pleased with myself.
But then you were saying it all went wrong, and then that was a very difficult day. It was hard to do the diary, and since then you've been restricted. So I wondered what your view was about why we thought it would be a good idea for you to do the diaries, or why we talked a bit about when I suggested you keeping the diary.
Well, I know that it was a way of helping me get in touch with my thoughts and feelings about eating.
Okay.
And I kind of lost sight of that on the first day because I was just so pleased with how things had gone.
Yeah.
But certainly the next day when everything went wrong, I was having to go back to this forced me to get in touch with my thoughts and feelings.
And I think what you're describing is really what this hard work is about, isn't it? Because in a way, if it was all like the first day, I mean, it'd be great if it was, wouldn't it? You'd be, you'd be saying you'd be a lot happier. But in fact, getting in touch with some of this distress and feeling it was wrong, it sounds as if, in fact, it's giving us quite a lot of information, although certainly really uncomfortable for you.
Yeah.
So interesting that as we said, it's uncomfortable. It's also difficult. I think it's a really helpful observation you're making. It's very hard to remember. So say if we were meeting and I was asking you to think about last Thursday, how possible would that be?
Well, now I realise it would be very naive to think that I'd be able to remember a week later, or even this was just hours later. I couldn't remember.
Isn't that interesting? So in fact, in the power of that moment, it sounds as if the emotion just is quite overwhelming. So would it be an idea to go on to considering this episode, because you're saying that, again, if we just reflect, Wednesday was, you said it was good and that's how you'd like your eating to be. Thursday, less so, and you saying it all went wrong. Did it feel that it was that much of a contrast?
Well, I started at home having my breakfast, cereal and coffee, fine, healthy breakfast, not skimping.
Right.
Lunch, jacket potato, even had cheese in it.
Okay.
And then mid-afternoon, I was still at work, I'm putting W for work. I thought, well, I'll have a snack because I felt in control. And I'd got a small bar of chocolate, it was just a small bar. And I intended to have half of it.
Yeah.
And once I'd eaten half of it, I ate the whole of it. And once I'd ate the whole of it, I started to feel, well, I've blown it now, I'm not in control. And I always keep snacks in my drawer in my office. And so I just essentially worked through all the biscuits and snacks that I had in my drawer. I have done that in the past, with my office door shut.
Yeah.
But this time, in the middle of it, was a knock on the door, and the door sort of flew open, and it was a couple of colleagues coming in good humour. You know, they wanted to invite me to something, and there I was, just faced like a hamster, crumbs all over, wrappers around me, and it was obvious I'd been binging. And I've always managed to hide it from people. No one's known. All these years, no one's known, apart from you and the GP. And now these colleagues know. And I was devastated, and I knocked off work early, and I went home, and I just ate myself into oblivion that night. And it's a bit vague, because I'm a bit vague about precisely what I ate. And I started with biscuits and bread and jam, and moved on to cereals, and it went on for about an hour. But it's all a bit of a fog.
And clearly as well, the way you're talking about it and the way you mentioned it before, it's really stayed with you. The thoughts and feelings have stayed with you. So if we were sort of teasing it out a bit, so you were saying there was a real thought, it's all gone wrong and I've blown it now. Is that the kind of sense of it? Because interesting, in fact, because can you remind me what you said about breakfast and lunch?
Breakfast and lunch I'd done quite well, really. They've both been sensible. Probably hadn't eaten quite enough at lunch, so I was feeling a bit peckish in the afternoon.
Right,
but that
so,
was fine, because I'm allowed a snack.
Okay, so in fact that's really interesting as well, that breakfast in fact was okay. Lunch, you had your lunch, which again is great, although you were saying in fact you might have been a little bit hungry.
Yeah, I probably would have done better to have a banana or something like I'd done the day before, and then I wouldn't have gotten hungry mid-afternoon.
So then when you had, your intention was to eat half the bar of chocolate?
Yeah, because I at that moment I felt in control.
Okay.
And so I thought, well, I'll buy a bar of chocolate, and I'm eating normally now,
Yeah.
and I'll just have half of it, that's reasonable.
But then in fact you ate it all.
Yeah.
And the thought you said then was, I've blown it now, I'm not in control. And so that seems a really powerful thought for you about not being in control. And if we think about the formulation we were looking at last time, it does seem that it's very all or nothing. It's that, wanting to do things completely well, or it'll be terrible. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I think that's true. I think that is a pattern. I think I'm a bit all or nothing.
So because you weren't completely in control, if we did a sort of 0 to 100 line, would it be, if I'm not completely in control, where would you be?
Oh, I wouldn't use a line, I'd flip. I'd either be down one end or up the other.
So it'd be like two boxes,
Yeah.
really, either
Yeah.
total control or
Yeah.
I've blown it. So if we say here, I've blown it all, I'm not in control at all, so that's
like 100%.
okay. So that's the thought.
That's the thought, yeah.
And then, you were also saying that that's associated with tremendous amount of emotion. So if we were saying, here's the thought, I've blown it all, I'm not in control at all, what were you feeling then?
I was feeling hopeless, stupid, quite miserable at that thought. But as I'm saying it, I'm also realising that there's also a part of me that's quite pleased to say that, because that's what allows me to then eat more.
Right. So there's a sort of sense of being pleased and relieved that here
It's
we
really,
go.
yeah,
sort of
yeah. I
thing.
don't have to struggle against this anymore.
Right.
I can go with it. But it's funny because at the same time, I'm feeling quite miserable about the whole thing.
So this is really fascinating, because in fact it's showing how complex this all is, isn't it? So there's a thought, I've blown it all, I'm not in control.
Yeah.
Also, I put I'm stupid down as a thought really rather than a feeling. Is that okay?
Yeah,
So I'm stupid.
Yeah.
And so feeling hopeless and miserable, but also a sense of, I don't need to struggle anymore, and a bit of a relief.
That is a
Okay.
relief actually.
And in behaviour here, we've got you starting to binge, and you saying you usually have quite a lot of food in your days. Okay, so it's
Yeah, but
there.
some of it has been there for months.
All right.
And it didn't taste too good, but that doesn't really matter.
Okay, but sometimes people almost use the phrase "I've started, so I'll finish." I don't know if that.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I do have that sense
Yeah.
that I might as well now just get it all out of the way. I suppose it's that all or nothing thing again, isn't it?
So here we have this sense of it. Just if I can check that this is how it was. It was a thought, I've blown it all. I'm not in control, feeling really hopeless and miserable, but then looping back into more thoughts about this is stupid, but also a bit of relief, no need to struggle, and I can binge, and so then the binge goes long.
Yeah.
So is that a bit of the picture of what was happening?
I think that's right.
Yeah. And then, so on top of that, we've got suddenly the people coming in when you're in the midst of all this. It must have been a real shock.
Yeah.
Gosh. And so what went through your mind then?
I panicked. I was thinking, oh my God, they're going to know. They're going to see the real me.
Right.
They're going to see the real disgusting, worthless me.
Okay.
Stupid me.
And what actually happens there? Because the people came in, you had this panic. I mean, it sounds like it was horrible, and this, oh my God, they're going to see the real me. And then what actually happened?
But I just tried to act as though nothing was happening. I swallowed as fast as I could and tried to appear normal. I don't think I did appear normal. And then they told me about the party that they were having. That's what they kind of invite me to that. And I said I'm happy to go to the party, and then I said I've got to get on with my work.
Right.
And that's when they left.
And how long was that for?
It wasn't very long actually.
Right. So you were in the middle of eating, they came in, you tried to sort of, sounds if you really made a big effort, gather yourself together, act as if I'm okay. And is that something that you're familiar with, trying to, act fine?
Yeah, I think I always try to do that, but I think I usually pull it off, but this time with stuffed cheeks and crumbs all over, I don't think I could have looked normal.
Okay, so you had a thought that I don't look normal.
They're going to know.
They're going to know. And then they left after asking you about the
Just
party.
after a minute or two, it wasn't long.
Okay, so for a minute or two they were there talking. And this was on Thursday, okay?
Yeah.
And then what you said, you were then really left with lots of thoughts and a preoccupation about this.
I couldn't settle down to work again.
Okay.
So I actually went home early, and I just said I'm taking some work home with me. And that's not unusual in our department. Many people work at home exclusively, almost. And then when I got home, I had it in mind that all I was going to do was eat. So I knew that I was heading towards an evening of oblivion.
So you were saying, I'm going to eat, and this was a thought, I'll head for oblivion, I'll block it all out. Oblivion from what?
I just, of how bad I felt, the thoughts about, what my colleagues must think of me, what they're going to say, how many people know, how this would change maybe my relationship with them. I just didn't want to think about it anymore.
So can I just, as well, because again, I think you're doing such a good job to remember all this, because again, as you've said before, often it would just be blocked out. And yet it strikes me you're giving a really clear picture. I wonder how it is right now to be talking about it.
I don't I don't like talking about it, but the more I'm focusing on it now, the more vividly I seem to be able to remember.
Okay, so that's really
things.
helpful. So is this just feeling, because initially you said feeling bad, wanting the oblivion, and yet also a bit of a sense, in a similar way, is there a sense of sort of relief, well, at least I can do this to block the feelings out?
There was a sense of urgency. You know, I have to get home now, then I can binge and I can block it out.
Okay,
So I felt really driven
right.
to binge.
And what you're trying to block out is the thoughts about what your colleagues
Yeah.
might make of you.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and again, if we think back to the formulation, one of the things you'd said is that other people are critical and rejecting,
Yeah.
and the world is harsh. So part of what you do is strive to appear perfect so that everyone will like you. So
Yeah.
again, is this a bit of what was going on?
Well, yes, this is what I was, I guess, anticipating, that the word would get around and people would want to know me.
So can I put that down? So the thought would be, word will get around, and nobody will want to know me.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what?
Then I'm on my own. Nobody knows me.
Oh, okay. And how powerful and convincing a thought was that? This is me on my own.
Well, that's a very convincing thought, because that's the thought that I have most of the time anyway. So I suppose what it did is just make that seem inevitable. I do my best not to be the misfit, the outsider. But now I felt that there was no hope for me ever being anything other than that.
So again, it sounds as if it's going into another loop of nobody wants to know me, I'm on my own, I'm a misfit, I feel awful, you were restless and couldn't settle. Were these thoughts kind of, so as we talk about people, having ruminative thoughts where you just, it's going round and round and round and round, and not being able to settle because partly of the thoughts. And so part of going into the oblivion with the binging is to block all this out and not think about it.
Exactly.
So it would be feeling awful, binge. But I suppose then what happens to your mood when you have binged?
For a while, I am kind of on another emotional plane.
Yeah.
And I also drank some wine, which helps to do that. But there comes a point where I guess even I'm beginning to feel uncomfortable with the binging, and that's when I vomit.
Okay.
So I did binge and vomit that night.
Yeah. So if I can just, because I think it's really important, given the work that you've done in recording this and how difficult it was, that we sort of get the most information out of it. And does this seem a helpful thing to be doing, or how? Well, I just wonder if it was okay to continue with this.
Yeah. I'm actually now saying much more than I've written down.
Yeah.
I haven't written down so much in terms of the thoughts and the feelings. The questions you're asking me are teasing out more thoughts and feelings, so perhaps I did this wrong.
But I think in a way, as you're rightly saying, Sarah, at the time and even afterwards, very difficult to get a very clear idea. And this is the first time you've done food diary.
Yeah.
So in fact, I wonder, given that it's given us a real way into hearing more about it, what do you think it has been a helpful thing to do?
Well, it's made me feel worse. So it starts. It does start to clarify things. And, there's this patterns you're talking about. I can see those. But I think before I came here, I'd managed to distance myself a bit from that event. I know it was me who said I wanted to talk about it, because it still preoccupies me. But I now realise that I have distanced myself, and talking about it in details made me feel worse again, made me feel more scared again.
Right. I think it's a really helpful observation you're making, that in fact what we're doing in therapy is actually asking you to move in towards this a bit, which is, it's the brave step you're taking of choosing to do this. I think you're right. Because in a way, it sounds as if in the past your response would have been, as you say, to distance yourself from it a bit, sometimes with the wine or the binging, or sometimes, as we see from the Friday, restricting, because that damps the feelings down, doesn't it? It's quite effective.
And that's I've been doing that for days now.
Okay.
And that does help me feel back in control.
Okay.
And also I feel that I've got to be super in control now to make up for losing control so publicly on Thursday.
So again, there's the thought about not being in control, as we said before, about either in the control box or the shambles box. Yeah. But now it sounds as if you've gone into sort of uber control, even more so.
Actually.
Okay. And again, if we're looking at this, it sounds as if, binging, but then going into the restricting to damp the feelings down. But what tends to happen after that?
Well, typically I can restrict for a while, and then I just get so hungry that I eat, and once I start to eat, it's Thursday all over again.
Right.
Or I keep on eating.
So if you restrict for a bit, it feels better, a bit like with the binging, for a bit it feels better, but then it just sort of trips you into this awful all or nothing pattern again. And what was your intention in coming for some help? What is it that you're wanting?
This week?
Just generally.
Well, I want to eat normally.
Okay.
And I want to feel that I want to like myself.
Yeah, and that doesn't seem unreasonable. But does this pattern of eating, how does that affect both of those, your view of yourself and you eating normally?
It just confirms that I'm weird.
Okay.
Misfit. Rather disgusting, actually.
Is that the view you have when this is happening? And then does that buy into this thought of nobody wanting to know me?
Yeah.
Right. So I guess going into it and thinking a bit more about what's going on, it may be helpful in having a bit more sense of how this pattern keeps going.
Yeah.
Because I'm also interested in, coming back to your concern about how the people see you and nobody wants to know me, I'm on my own and always will be. Can I ask what happened the next day at work?
Well, I kept a low profile, really. And if I could have worked at home, I would have stayed at home.
So ideally, you wouldn't have wanted to go in, because were you still having a lot of thoughts about, I'm on my own and I'm a misfit? Yeah. But did people speak to you at work?
Yes, although I did go to my room and shut the door, and I kept myself to myself.
Right.
And at the weekend I didn't see anyone. Well, I did see Alistair, but not for long, because he's got a family weekend this weekend.
Because you mentioned as well that the people had come in to talk about a party.
Yeah.
When's that?
Oh, that's not for another week, 10 days.
Right. Has that been mentioned at all at work again?
Yeah, because they've asked lots of people at work, most people in fact.
Right.
And so, there's some buzz about it.
Okay. So again, the thought you had from the result of people seeing you was a bit about people knowing that you're binging, and it's something you wanted to keep very much to yourself because it makes you feel so bad, and you view it as really in such a it's disgusting and horrible, but also partly that it feeds into your belief that nobody wants to know you and you'll be on your own forever. So where does that fit in with how work was on Friday? It certainly sounds as if you kept yourself to yourself, but would it be true that you were completely on your own and nobody taught you at all?
No. I did go out a few times, and to go to the loo or to go to the coffee maker. And people were quite civil.
Okay.
So, yeah, I wasn't completely rejected.
Yeah. Because again, if we think about the way that your thinking tends to be in this, sort of very all or nothing fashion, how would that fit in with this belief about I'm on my own and a misfit, nobody wants to know me? Because what would be at the other end?
Oh, I'm one of the team. I'm like other people.
Okay.
I belong.
Okay. And if we stopped it being so all or nothing and maybe drew a line so that at one end there was totally one of the team completely belonging and the other end there was a misfit, where would you put yourself? Say on the Friday when people talked a bit when you went out.
Well, if this is this the misfit end?
Yes.
Okay. Then maybe I wasn't completely in this box. Maybe I was a little bit outside.
So a little bit outside. Because it's the benefit really of having the line, isn't it? Because if they're not joined at all, hard to move yourself
then it's
along.
that pattern that I mentioned before where I kind of swing from one to the other.
Okay.
Yeah, no, you're right. And actually it's interesting looking at it and talking about it because I probably put myself there because I kept away from other people and wasn't very sociable. And maybe if I'd been a bit more sociable, I'd have been less of a misfit, felt less of a misfit.
So it's interesting that the impulse you have when you think you're a misfit is what?
To keep away from people.
Okay, but as you're saying, in fact, what would
that
be?
just means that I am a misfit because I'm putting myself in that position.
So horrible
antisocial.
feeling, really. I'm just aware of the times there, and I think we'd said today we were going to have a look at your diary and consider particularly this thought and the really upsetting episode where people saw you and that's preoccupied you for a while. What do you make of what we've done today?
Well, again, like last time, it's helpful pulling out these patterns because I can see why I was so vulnerable to binging, and that fits in with these boxes and lines that you've been drawing. And I can also see why it hit me so hard because when you went back to that big diagram that we did last time, it fits in with that. Fits in with some of the beliefs that we talked about last time. So it helps me make sense. So perhaps I don't feel quite so negative about myself. I don't feel good, but maybe I'm not so hard on myself, which is helpful.
Yeah, and I think what it's shown me as well is how what a brave step you're taking to begin to do some of this, because it's extremely painful, isn't it?
It is horrible.
It's going into thoughts that really it must be very hard even to put into words. And I guess that's what the binging and restricting are protecting you from.
And actually I realise now that I've avoided putting them into words, and maybe I need to do more detailed accounts of my thoughts and my feelings.
Right. So if we said, if we're thinking in the last few minutes about some homework for next time, because you're saying what it's been helpful with is it making things a bit clearer, linking in what's going on now into the bigger picture and helping you be a bit more aware of your feelings, which was certainly one of the things you wanted.
Yeah.
So how could we take this on? What might be something to continue to move things on?
Well, I think that I'll keep the diaries, I'll continue with the diaries, but I'll try and put more detail about my thoughts and my feelings, and then I'd probably like to try what you do, which is identifying patterns that I get locked into.
Right.
Quite like to have a go at doing that myself.
So if we say that, let's, because this is early days, this is our third session, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think given that you've started with the food diaries and you're wanting to expand the comments, how about if you do that and you write down some more thoughts and feelings as you were suggesting, and maybe we look at that again next time.
Right, so the patterns we can do together rather than me doing it on my own.
I think let's discuss that. I'm aware we haven't got an awful lot of time today, and I would like us to have more time to think about that.
Okay.
But it's what is terrific is how much information these diaries are giving us. Look at, it really was almost too much to cover, wasn't it? Which is great. So much we were getting. So if we say that you continue with the diaries, and bring that back next time, how does that sound manageable?
That does sound manageable.
Because I guess also knowing that you thinking about your high standards and wanting to do things really well, I suppose I'd be concerned what might happen if you set yourself to do too much.
Then I might not achieve what I've set out, and then I'd feel terrible.
Which just thinking generally about today, you were saying what you've taken away. Was there anything about today that you were less happy with, Sarah, or that wasn't clear, or you'd want to say anything more about?
No. I mean, I just wish that I hadn't got this meeting to go to, because I think it would be useful to spend more time talking around the issues. But
isn't it great? We're going to have more sessions, and it sounds as if you did all you could to change. It's just life, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, thank you. So we'll say the same time next week.
And I will really make sure that we get the full hour next week.
That'd be really good. Thank you.
Okay, so you've spent some time watching the role-play treatment session. Now it's time to provide numerical ratings on the ACCS scale. So this is the third step in completing your assessment. You'll remember that there's 8 different domains that the ACCS scale is assessing, so 8 different aspects of competence that we'll be looking at, and there's between 1 and 5 different items within each of these domains. So we're going to look at each domain in turn and think about what's being assessed by that domain and what ratings we might provide for this particular session. So it's really important to try thinking about these different items as independent aspects of competence. Otherwise, we end up giving quite global impressions and being over-influenced by certain aspects of competence over others. So first of all, we're going to have a look at agenda setting. So domain 1 is about planning and setting an agenda. This is a particularly discrete aspect of the session, usually the first few minutes of the session, where the agenda is set between the therapist and the client about what is going to be covered in that session. So this domain has 2 particular items. First of all is about the suitability of the items. So did the therapist help the patient to identify and prioritise specific, relevant and appropriate agenda items? The second item is about the feasibility of that agenda. Did it seem like, given the amount of time that they had in the session, that actually the items that they included on that agenda were realistic and were feasible? So what exactly is it that we're assessing using this domain? As I say, it's particularly thinking about those first few minutes or so of the session where the therapist and client work together to set that agenda. What we're not talking about here is what was subsequently covered in the session. So whether the agenda was adhered to, what was actually covered, comes under a later domain, domain 6, effective use of time. So here we're just thinking about what seems suitable and feasible at the outset of the session. So we remember that we need to provide numerical ratings on both of these items. And the numerical ratings range from 1 to 4 for each item. So number 1 demonstrates limited skill. So this is either that the feature wasn't outlined, so something wasn't there, for example an agenda wasn't set, or there was an absence of skill or an inappropriate performance which may have had negative therapeutic consequences. Number 2 is basic, so this shows that therapist performance is somewhat appropriate and there is some good degree of skill evident, but there are still some major problems. Number 3 is good, so this is showing that the therapist demonstrates a good degree of skill, there weren't any major problems, there may be some minor problems or some inconsistencies evident in the therapist's performance. And finally we have level 4, which is advanced, so this is thinking about consistent demonstration of a high level of skill, and there might be some minor problems, but there'd be very few and far between, and they would be very minor. Now what you need to do is to use the manual as your guide to decide whether to provide a rating of 1, 2, 3 or 4 for each of these items. Now you'll see, for example, here on the screen, and you can see in the manual in front of you, that for the first item, suitability of items, it gives some examples of the kind of performance we'd be expecting to see for a level 1, 2, 3 and 4 rating for that particular item. So it's really important to look at these item-specific examples to help you make a judgment about which numerical value to provide for that item. So we'd now like to ask you to complete some numerical ratings for domain 1, so for the agenda setting items. So work on your own to complete these ACCS ratings for the session that you've just viewed. Make sure that you use that ACCS manual as your guide for each of those items to decide what numerical ratings to provide. And complete your ratings on the feedback form, so it's useful here to just make some notes about which numerical value you're assigning and some notes about why, which will help to provide your formative feedback later on. If you're working in groups, you could come back together after you've completed your individual ratings to have a group discussion. So for each group member, perhaps say why you provided the numerical rating that you did, and explain that to the rest of the group. If you find that there's any differences in the values that you've assigned, explore those differences. Why do you think these occurred? Can you reach a group consensus? Can you agree on which rating you would provide? So we thought it would be helpful to explain what ratings we provided for these particular items. So these are the ratings provided by Dr. Frida McManus, myself, Kate Muse, and Dr. Sarah Rakoshkovich. So first of all, for item 1.1, suitability of items. We rated this as a 3 good. We provided this rating because the items seemed well suited to the stage of therapy. This is an early session. Items seemed quite relevant to the presenting problem. They seemed to fit well with the patient's presentation and the formulation and explanation of their problems provided. It seemed likely that progress could be made with these items during the session, even at the reduced 30 minutes. And the client and the therapist worked collaboratively in setting the agenda. We did, however, have some learning points to note, which were that the items could perhaps have been better defined. For example, the incident at work could have been defined a little more thoroughly, although there is a danger in outlining the items in too much depth and then beginning to actually start engaging in session work rather than actually just setting the agenda. We also noted that perhaps some of the standard items are missing. Now this is an early session, session 3. We did feel that during a later session a precedent might well have been set for these kinds of standard items to be there every session, so they may not need to be restated. But we did feel maybe at session 3 that it could be useful to put things like homework and feedback as specific agenda items. So now moving on to item 1.2, the feasibility of the agenda. We assigned this a rating of 3 good. This is because the items seem to be of suitable scope and significance, but we did note that the number of items on the agenda may not have been optimal. In particular, it seemed somewhat unlikely that all of the items could be thoroughly covered in session when the agenda was initially set at the outset. It did seem a little bit ambitious, and given that it was a shorter 30-minute session and that was known from the outset, it was a fairly early treatment session, and the patient was showing signs of being somewhat distressed about the issues that she wanted to discuss. It's worth noting here that we base this rating on what happened at the beginning of the session only. So this is how feasible the agenda seemed when it was set at the outset. What we didn't do is to rate this item based on what was actually covered in the session. So you'll notice later on that we gave the therapist credit for very skillful use of time in terms of time management and what she managed to cover during the session within domain 6 later on. So here we were just thinking about the feasibility of the agenda when it was first set. So we'd just invite you to spend a minute or two reflecting on that particular domain. What rating did you provide for the items in this domain? Did your ratings differ from ours? If they did, why? Would you change your rating after hearing our explanation or not? If you would, how would you change it and why? And what has this experience of rating the session on these domain items told you about how to rate these particular agenda items? Is there anything that you'll need to remember for next time in particular? Okay, so let's move on to domain 2. So this is the formulation item. What we're looking for here is whether the therapist has developed a coherent and dynamic formulation. Does this draw upon appropriate evidence-based theory to offer a concise, comprehensive and an individual personalised explanation of history, triggers and maintaining features of the presenting problem of the client? Now, this formulation item should be able to be rated on each session because it should be evident what kind of formulation that the therapist and client are working towards throughout the course of treatment. The formulation will of course evolve and develop as new information arises, patterns and themes emerge, and the formulation should be updated in light of these. What we're not looking for here is whether the therapist drew upon the formulation to highlight treatment targets and intervention strategies. That comes up a little bit later in CBT interventions. What we're looking at here is the explanation of the client's presenting problems. So what exactly is it that we're rating here for formulation? We are looking at what was drawn upon and referred to during the session. So what did the client and therapist discuss in relation to the formulation during the session? And obviously this will be different depending on the stage of therapy. But we can also look at what was written in the formulation in the cover sheet. So just to refresh your memory, here's the diagrammatic formulation that the therapist submitted and said that they were working to with the client at the moment. And so as with the last domain, we would invite you to pause the recording now to work on your own and provide a rating for this particular item in domain 2. So it's just one item thinking about formulation. If you're working in groups, perhaps then come together for some of that group discussion to compare and contrast the ratings that you provided. For item 2.1, the formulation item, we gave a rating of 3.5. This is because we felt that looking at the item descriptors, it really did fall just between a 3 good and a 4 advanced. We felt that the diagrammatic formulation that was submitted with the supporting documents gave a really coherent historical and current explanation of that individual patient's presenting problem. There were also quite clear and coherent maintenance cycles that were drawn out within the session. The therapist quite skillfully drew upon relevant evidence-based theory, thinking about regularity of eating, starvation and binge cycles, for example. And the theory was skillfully linked to the patient's individual presentation. So the theory was used to explain the individual's difficulties that they're experiencing. The cycles that were drawn out were also well suited to this very early stage of therapy, and the patient seemed very able to understand these cycles, and it seemed to help the patient to make sense of what was happening for them. And new clinical material did emerge within the session, and this was very skillfully and flexibly incorporated within the maintenance cycles drawn out in the session and added to that formulation that had been discussed previously with the patient. The reason that we gave a 3.5 rather than a 4 was two factors. One was that avoidance seemed like a really big part of the current problem for this particular patient. Within the session, they spent a lot of time talking about giving up avoidance and beginning to engage with the thoughts and feelings that the patient was experiencing as part of the treatment strategy at this point. This aspect of avoidance isn't explicitly incorporated either in the diagrammatic formulation submitted and or the maintenance cycles or the additional information that's incorporated within the formulation within the session that we heard. So we felt that there was perhaps an opportunity to incorporate this aspect of avoidance within that formulation. The other issue that we highlighted was that perhaps there was an opportunity to incorporate strength and resilience factors even at this early stage in treatment. For example, in relation to the issue of avoidance, by engaging in the homework, the patient does seem to have begun to have started dropping some of those avoidance behaviours. And the client and the therapist have a really useful conversation about how challenging yet helpful this was for the client. What we felt the therapist could perhaps have done is begin to draw out some of these positive cycles here. So this is why we gave a rating of 3.5. As with the previous domains, we'd invite you here to just pause the recording and take a moment or two to reflect on the scores that you provided for this domain and the scores that were provided by the scale authors for this domain. Let's move on to think about domain 3. This is a fairly large domain called CBT interventions that actually includes 5 different items. So what we're talking about here is cognitive and or behavioural interventions, what we might call CBT techniques. So these items are thinking about the selection and application of these different CBT techniques. These techniques are designed to promote therapeutic change by targeting cognitions, behaviours or emotions that seem to be likely to be maintaining the patient's problems. So we might be talking about a range of different CBT interventions that can usefully be used to promote therapeutic change. This includes things like cognitive restructuring, exposure with response prevention, thoughts records, behavioural experiments, and so on. Note that what we're not looking at here is whether the intervention was actually successful in bringing about change, but whether the interventions were skillfully selected and implemented. This is because there's a number of different factors other than therapist competence that can influence whether an intervention is successful in bringing about change. What we've tried to do within this domain is to break down the different aspects involved in selecting and delivering CBT interventions. So we start off by thinking about appropriate intervention targets. So this first item thinks about the therapist's ability to skillfully define, clarify and specify intervention targets that evidence-based theory and the patient's individual presenting problems seem to suggest may well be maintaining the difficulties that they're experiencing. So this first item really is thinking about the targets which the intervention is aiming to address. Do they seem appropriate? Following on from this, the second item, choosing suitable interventions, thinks about, are the cognitive and or behavioural interventions that are selected, do they seem to be appropriate? Do they form part of a kind of overall logical, coherent treatment strategy that seems like it's likely to bring about change in those treatment targets identified? Does that seem to be suited to the patient's therapeutic context? And does it seem to link into theory-based practice or research evidence where possible? The third item, rationale for interventions, thinks about whether the therapist can skillfully work with the patient to help facilitate their understanding of why they're actually conducting this intervention in the first place. So what's the importance of this intervention and what benefits may it bring about? The next item moves on to implementation of the interventions. So this thinks about whether the therapist can systematically implement the interventions in a fluent and articulate manner, and whether they're sensitive and responsive to the context, the therapeutic context, providing encouragement, praise and support as the intervention is delivered. Then finally, thinking about reviewing interventions. So this is whether the therapist provides a comprehensive review of the results of the intervention, whether they turned out as expected or not, and whether they helped the patient to identify significant learning from that experience. Again, whether that outcome was positive or negative, or as expected or not. Within this particular session recording, the interventions that we used were downward arrowing to identify target hot thoughts like I don't look normal, they're going to know, and these thoughts that linked back to the formulation. There was continuum work targeting all or nothing thinking like it's all gone wrong and I've blown it, which again was linked back to the formulation. Thought challenging, so testing evidence for and against, thoughts about people noticing. And finally, some work around reducing dietary restrictions. And now it's time to try it for yourself. So pause the recording and take some time to go through the ACCS manual and provide numerical ratings for this particular domain. Now we can move on to look at the ratings provided from the scale authors for item 3.1, appropriate intervention targets. We provided a rating of 3 good for this item. Downward arrowing was very skillfully used to elicit catastrophic thoughts, which were then targeted in the interventions. Thoughts like it all went wrong, people at work saw me binge and therefore I'm now completely alone. These seem to be hot thoughts that were tied to emotion and seem to be involved in the maintenance cycles drawn out with the patient. Appropriate behaviours were also targeted, for example the restrictive eating, and these seem relevant to the early stage of therapy, the individual's presentation, and seem likely again to be maintaining the patient's problems. The reason we gave a 3 rather than a 4 was that we had one key learning point, which was around the targets being more behavioural. We felt that given this early stage of treatment and the strong evidence base for behavioural interventions focusing on regular eating early on in treatment, the therapist could perhaps have focused more on the behavioural aspects of restricted eating here. Perhaps being a little bit more explicit and concrete in identifying and targeting this restricting behaviour. For item 3.2, thinking about the selection of suitable interventions, we gave a rating of 4. we found that the interventions selected formed part of a very coherent overall treatment strategy that was clearly guided by the individual's formulation and seemed appropriate for bringing about change, particularly in the thoughts identified. The interventions selected were also relevant to this very early stage of treatment and were clearly rooted in relevant theory and evidence. Item 3.3, the rationale for the interventions, we gave a 3 good. This is because there were some examples of very skillful facilitation of the importance and potential benefits of engaging in the interventions. Some of the work in the session, for example, involved asking the patient to engage with and notice thoughts and feelings instead of avoiding them. Here we saw some lovely work using Socratic questioning to encourage the patient to consider the pros and cons of doing this. But there were some inconsistencies in facilitating the patient's understanding. So for some of the interventions used, the rationale was not explicit in the session, and there was little discussion about why we are doing what we are doing. Although the work did link to the maintenance cycles drawn out, the interventions could have been perhaps a bit more explicitly linked to these maintenance cycles, and the patient's understanding of why we're engaging in these interventions could have been checked out. For item 3.4, implementing interventions, we provided a rating of 4 advanced. This is because we found there was consistent high level of skill in delivering the interventions selected. The interventions were carefully and thoroughly implemented, even though the relatively limited time available did make this quite a challenging task. Interventions were systematically implemented. They were seen right through from the start to their conclusion. Throughout the delivery of the interventions, the therapist was consistently fluent and articulate and provided the patient with appropriate levels of support and praise and encouragement throughout. Finally, the therapist also appropriately adapted the interventions to suit the individual patient, using skillful Socratic questioning to encourage engagement and tailor the interventions to that individual's needs and current ability. For item 3.5, reviewing interventions, we gave a rating of 3 good. There is some clear evidence of the therapist very skillfully working with the patient to help them identify what they learnt from the interventions that were used in the session. For example, the patient identifies clear learning points, such as, I can see what made me vulnerable. Maybe I don't need to be so hard on myself. But we did feel that the therapist could perhaps have asked the patient more explicitly what she learnt from the interventions and from the outcomes of the interventions. A comprehensive review is challenging in this session given the limited time available, but some further elicitation of the impact of the interventions and how they link back to the thoughts and behaviours they were designed to target would have been perhaps beneficial. So, for example, when the therapist explores the usefulness of having a line in the continuum work, they could perhaps have spent a little bit more time exploring a bit more about what and how this line might be useful. As with the previous domains, we'd invite you here to just pause the recording and take a moment or two to reflect on the scores that you provided for this domain and the scores that were provided by the scale authors for this domain. Now we can move on to domain 4, the homework items. So within this domain there's 4 different items. And similarly to the interventions domain, we've tried to break these down into the different phases involved in reviewing and setting new homework. So the first item really focuses on the review of homework that was completed from the previous session, so between this session and the one before. So this item really looks at whether the therapist has worked with the patient to help them conduct a comprehensive review of the homework that was previously completed and help them to identify what they learnt from that experience. And this is important whether the homework was completed, not completed, went as expected or not. So what we're assessing within this particular session that we're looking at is the review of the food diary. So this was the homework task that was completed between sessions. Just to remind you, you've got a copy of that homework diary in the supporting documents. The next three items think about the new homework task that was set to be completed after the session that we've viewed. So the first item thinks about the suitability of the new homework task. Was a task planned that seems to fit within the therapeutic framework? Is it relevant to the context? Does it build upon the material that was covered during the session and or the homework task from the previous session? The second item thinks about the rationale for the homework. Does the patient fully understand why they're completing this homework task? What the importance or potential benefits are of completing this? And finally, thinking about planning of homework. So thinking about any potential obstacles or blocks that might get in the way of completing the homework, thinking about making sure that the patient understands exactly what they need to do and when. And so what we're thinking about assessing within this particular treatment session is the continuing completion of the food diary. So this is building upon the homework task from last time, thinking about adding more detail in, particularly around thoughts and feelings. And now it's time to try it for yourself. So pause the recording and take some time to go through the ACCS manual, provide numerical ratings for this particular domain. Let's have a look at the ratings provided by the scale authors for this particular domain. So first of all, reviewing homework item. We assigned here a rating of 4, advanced. The reason for this was that a really thorough and comprehensive review of the homework task, the food diary, was completed, especially given the limited time available. We felt that the depth of the review seemed very appropriate given that the review seemed to be helping the client to make progress. The therapist also helped the patient to identify what they had learnt from the experience of completing the food diary, and recognised and very sensitively discussed the kind of challenges and difficulties that the patient faced in completing the homework task, particularly in relation to the challenge of giving up some of those avoidance behaviours. In light of this, she also revisited the rationale in terms of why the task was being completed and how this may be beneficial, which seemed important given the challenges that the patient faced when completing the diary at home. For item 4.2, choosing suitable homework, we gave a rating of 3, good. This is because the new homework task identified was appropriate given the patient's presentation and the very early stage of treatment. And the therapist worked well with the patient to help them identify this new homework task. The task seemed to build well upon the previous homework set and indeed the session content by kind of adding the thoughts and feelings aspect to the food diary that was completed previously. We did note that there were perhaps opportunities for further learning that were missed. So, for example, could perhaps regular eating patterns have been usefully explored within the diary? For example, they could have experimented with adding in half banana as a mid-morning snack half of the days and not the other half of the days, and then rating her urge to binge when she had the extra snack and when she didn't. Or, for example, the patient suggested exploring patterns that she'd identified within the session as she completed the new homework task, and adding these to the diary. The therapist suggests that this perhaps is too challenging at this point, and we just wondered whether, given the patient's enthusiasm about this additional element and the importance of the patterns that were identified, we wondered whether the therapist might at least have perhaps explored how she might have drawn out these patterns and whether this was something that was achievable. Item 4.3, rationale for homework, we gave a rating of 3, good. We gave this rating because the therapist had reviewed the rationale for completing the food diary in the context of reviewing the previous homework task, which is obviously related. However, she didn't explicitly revisit the importance of or the rationale for adding to this food diary. So we felt that it wasn't perhaps clear that the patient had understood why they were perhaps adding these thoughts and feelings to the food diary. Why was this a potentially helpful thing to do? Although it's worth noting that we do recognise that this was challenging given the short amount of time available in the session. Finally, item 4.4, planning of homework. For this item we gave a rating of 3, good. The therapist worked with the patient to make sure that she had a coherent plan for completing the homework and one that she understood. But the therapist didn't ask specifically about potential obstacles that could get in the way of completing this task. We felt that this seemed important here as there was potential for problems to arise in completing the homework, given the challenges she had faced when completing the food diary last time. For example, the patient may have found it too emotionally challenging or overwhelming to complete, and therefore could have given up on the task completely. That being said, the therapist had worked with the patient throughout the session to make sure that she would be able to continue with completing the food diary despite experiencing some level of distress. So perhaps this could have just been reiterated here. We also noted that the homework task could perhaps have been more specifically outlined or set up in a little bit more detail. So just outline exactly what the patient was completing on the food diary and when. Again, this was challenging though, given the limited time available during the session. As with the previous domains, we'd invite you here to just pause the recording, take a moment or two to reflect on the scores that you provided for this domain and the scores that were provided by the scale authors for this domain. Let's move on to think about domain 5. This domain assesses appropriate tracking of progress. Lots of different methods can usefully be employed to assess change and progress. Things like standardised questionnaires, the Beck Anxiety Inventory, the Beck Depression Inventory, for example, or more informal idiosyncratic measures, things like diaries, frequency counts, ratings of duration event or an experience, self-ratings of emotions or cognitions, that kind of thing. We're looking here at whether these methods are employed across treatment, so to measure change in symptoms and movement towards goals over the entire course of treatment as a whole. But we're also thinking about employing measures within treatment sessions to examine the impact of interventions completed within the session or for homework, so for example belief ratings pre or post intervention. What we're looking at here when assessing appropriate tracking of progress is what was done within the session, but also any relevant written materials like completed questionnaires, belief ratings and so on that were submitted with the session recording cover sheet. So this domain is broken down into 2 items. So first of all we have something about the suitability of the measures that were selected. So were the questionnaires or idiosyncratic methods, were they relevant, were they suitable, were they valid and reliable measures? Do they seem to be measuring change in symptoms and associated features and movement towards goals for that particular client? Secondly, we're thinking about whether those chosen measures were implemented effectively. So this is thinking about when the measures were actually used and reviewed. So is that monitoring schedule appropriate to provide clinically useful information, and was the information skillfully reviewed and interpreted? And did the therapist respond to the information that those measures provided for them? So within this particular session recording that we're rating here, we're thinking about what was used and referred to in the session, but also what was on the cover sheet. So just to remind you, what the therapist here has noted is that at the beginning of treatment they administered the BDI, BAI and the EDQ, and they give the scores for that, and they will be re-administering those questionnaires at the review session. So this is information that we have to rate these particular items. And now it's time to try it for yourself. So pause the recording and take some time to go through the ACCS manual and provide numerical ratings for this particular domain. So thinking about the ratings from the scale authors, we provided for the suitability of the measures chosen a rating of 3 good. The therapist in the supporting documentation says that they have selected the BDI, the BAI and the EDQ. These seem to be valid, reliable and suitable measures given the patient's presentation. But we did feel that what was missing here in terms of measures that could have been selected is a more idiosyncratic measure or measures. So they could have usefully selected and employed something which would give information about the patient's particular individual difficulties that they're experiencing. For example, a frequency of binging or purging could have been recorded, a mood rating could have been recorded, or even just a simple 0 to 10 problem severity rating may have perhaps provided helpful information about the level of current difficulties the patient was experiencing. For item 5.2, implementing measures, we gave a rating of 1 limited. The monitoring schedule for the standardised measures was somewhat appropriate, so the BDI, the BAI and the EDQ were used at assessment and will be used again at follow-up, as noted on the supporting information. So it does seem like some tracking of progress is there from pre to post treatment. But we noted 2 key issues. Most significantly, the monitoring schedule could have been more clinically useful. So here there was a missed opportunity for regular monitoring of week-by-week progress, as no measures are completed weekly or reviewed in this particular session. This regular monitoring could have involved completing and reviewing the formal questionnaire measures, although it may be argued that these are not needed at every session. But we did feel that at least a shorter, simpler, idiosyncratic measure would have provided some useful information about ongoing progress. And we felt that this was important because the patient and therapist perhaps need to have a sense of whether the problem is getting better, worse, or is about the same, especially at this early stage of treatment, and especially given that the patient feels, although she's failing all the time. We also noted that within session change wasn't assessed, so there wasn't any rating of degree of conviction, for example, in beliefs to assess the impact of interventions. As with the previous domains, we'd invite you here to just pause the recording and take a moment or two to reflect on the scores that you provided for this domain and the scores that were provided by the scale authors for this domain. Domain 6 looks at effective use of time within the session. So the first item is about pace. This is thinking about the therapist's ability to pace the session in a manner that's suited well to the context and to the patient's ability and capacity for learning. So was the pace moving too quickly or too slowly, for example? Time management is thinking about the ability to manage time across the session in a balanced manner. So did balanced and efficient allocation of time mean that all important issues were thoroughly covered and that the length of the session was as scheduled? And then finally, maintained focus thinks about the therapist's ability to work with the client to keep focus on important issues, perhaps those outlined in the agenda, while still demonstrating a flexible approach if unanticipated issues arise. This item is measuring effective use of time across the whole session. So in that sense, it's a slightly more general domain than some of the other domains. So it's referring to use of time, to pace, time management and focus across the entire session. And now it's time to try it for yourself. So pause the recording and take some time to go through the ACCS manual, provide numerical ratings for this particular domain. For item 6.1 pace, we gave a rating of 4 advanced. Given the challenge of having a briefer session, the therapist did a beautiful job of maintaining an appropriate pace throughout the session. Although the pace did pick up and was a little bit quicker at the end, we did feel that the therapist still didn't rush the patient. The therapist also effectively matched the pace of the session to the patient's capacity, spending more time unpacking the more emotive issues that arose. For item 6.2, time management, we gave a rating of 3.5, falling between good and advanced. We felt that there was generally a well-balanced and efficient use of time within the session, meaning that most important issues were adequately covered. But the beginning, middle and end could perhaps have been a little more balanced, with more time being set aside for items such as setting homework and reviewing the session at the end. However, getting this balance right was challenging, given the limited time available and the level of emotion surrounding the issue covered in the session. It could, for example, be argued that from a clinical perspective, it was important to spend time exploring the difficult experience that the patient brought to the session and taking the opportunity to intervene. However, this decision could perhaps have been made a little more openly and explicitly with the patient. For item 6.3, maintained focus, we gave a rating of 4 advanced. The therapist maintained focus on the items planned within the agenda and guided the patient to stay on topic, meaning that relevant and pertinent issues were discussed throughout the session. This was particularly important given the shorter nature of the session. The therapist also did not admit any important issues or tasks, including those end-of-session tasks such as feedback and a review of the session, setting new homework. We felt that these could easily have been missed given the briefer nature of the session. Although you will note that we've highlighted that more time could have been given to these end-of-session tasks in the time management item. As with the previous domains, we'd invite you here to just pause the recording and take a moment or two to reflect on the scores that you provided for this domain and the scores that were provided by the scale authors for this domain. Moving on to domain 7, fostering the therapeutic relationship. This is broken down into 3 items. First item thinks about interpersonal style. This is the therapist's ability to embody a positive interpersonal style, and one which is adapted so that it is congruent with the therapeutic context. The second item thinks about empathic understanding. So this is the therapist's ability to pick up on verbal, emotional and non-verbal cues to really grasp both the content and the emotional tone of the patient's worldview. And not only to grasp this, but to sensitively and appropriately convey this understanding to the client so that they feel listened to and understood. The final item is thinking about collaboration. So this is the therapist's ability to encourage the patient to take an active role in and to share responsibility throughout the session in a manner that is suited to this stage of therapy and the patient's presentation. So this domain is a more general domain. So rather than focusing on a specific aspect of the session, this domain is thinking about the therapeutic relationship across the entire session. And now it's time to try it for yourself. So pause the recording and take some time to go through the ACCS manual and provide numerical ratings for this particular domain. For item 7.1, interpersonal style, we gave a rating of 4 advanced. We felt that the therapist very clearly conveyed a very genuine, encouraging interpersonal style and a real sense of open-minded curiosity. We also felt that the therapist showed levels of warmth and support that were very much appropriate to the patient's current needs. For example, she didn't get overly involved in the emotion the patient was experiencing and managed to maintain an appropriate level of professionalism, yet she still clearly conveyed a very real sense of warmth and kindness within the moment. For item 7.2, empathic understanding, we gave a rating of 4 advanced. We felt that the therapist seemed genuinely empathic and attentive throughout. There was a real feeling that she was just gently discovering the patient's inner world and experiences. She very skillfully noticed and attended to both verbal and non-verbal and emotional cues to help her better understand the patient's inner world. And she regularly checked out her understanding of the patient's viewpoint, often reflecting back the patient's own words and really ensuring that the patient felt fully listened to and understood. For item 7.3, collaboration, we gave a rating of 4 advanced. The therapist encouraged and supported the patient in taking the lead in the session, but still provided appropriate guidance and support for a session so early on in treatment. Throughout, it felt very much like they were working alongside each other. For example, the therapist checked out were they okay to continue with certain topics that the patient seemed to be finding challenging. Although the less balanced use of time did mean that the session was somewhat less collaborative at the end, the therapist still did not take control of the session or become more prescriptive or didactic, which we did feel could easily have happened when a little bit more push for time. Instead, she still managed to really encourage the patient to take an active role and to share responsibility. As with the previous domains, we'd invite you here to just pause the recording and take a moment or two to reflect on the scores that you provided for this domain and the scores that were provided by the scale authors for this domain. The final domain, domain 8, focuses on effective two-way communication. This involves 2 items. The first, patient feedback, refers to the therapist's ability to elicit, explore and respond to positive and negative feedback about the patient's understanding of and reaction to all aspects of the session throughout. The second item, reflective summaries, thinks about whether the therapist can effectively work alongside the patient to help them reflect upon and summarise really key session content to help both parties understand the key therapeutic material and to consolidate learning for the client. Again, Domain 8 is thinking about effective two-way communication throughout the entire session. And now it's time to try it for yourself. So pause the recording and take some time to go through the ACCS manual and provide numerical ratings for this particular domain. For item 8.1, patient feedback, we gave a rating of 3.5. The therapist consistently checked the patient's understanding of and reaction to all elements of the session, asking questions like, can I just check how this is? How was it for you to keep the diary? So on. The therapist also skillfully elicited feedback on the session, asking questions like, what do you make of what we've done today? Importantly, she also openly encouraged any negative feedback on the session. We did feel that she could perhaps have facilitated a more thorough and detailed discussion of feedback on this session. We also noted that she could have asked for patient feedback from the previous session. For item 8.2, reflective summaries, we gave a rating of 4 advanced. This is because we felt the therapist consistently helped the patient to consolidate key learning, so this was throughout the session. She skillfully reflected back and summarised salient information using capsule summaries. Particularly skillful was the fact that she was highlighting not only the content, i.e. what was said explicitly, but also what the patient was implicitly trying to convey, therefore really helping the patient to gain new insights and perspective. As with the previous domains, we'd invite you here to just pause the recording and take a moment or two to reflect on the scores that you provided for this domain and the scores that were provided by the scale authors for this domain. Now that we've rated all individual items within the scale, we can look at the final total score, which is calculated by adding all of the scores for each item and ranges from 22 to 88. And an average item score. So this is the total score divided by 22, the number of items. We can see for this particular session we've got a total score of 74.5 and an average item score of 3.39. So this is useful just for providing the therapist and the assessor with an idea of where the therapist is falling over the session as a whole. We can also provide a global numerical rating. This similarly is to provide an overall indication of where the therapist's performance was lying across the session as a whole. So this again is being rated on this 1 to 4 scale from limited, basic, good through to advanced. In terms of the ratings provided by the scale authors, here we provided an overall rating of 3.5, falling just between good and advanced. Overall, we felt the therapist demonstrated a very high level of skill. However, there were some minor problems and inconsistencies in the therapist's performance. And the final numerical rating is a rating of patient complexity. Now, we haven't incorporated patient complexity within the scoring system of individual items, and this is because we didn't want to confound the ratings, so we didn't want people to get a lower competence score just because the client that they were seeing was somewhat more straightforward. However, we did think that it was important to include a complexity rating to provide some contextual information for the assessor. For example, within the context of a training course or within the context of supervision, the assessor may ask for the therapist to submit a more complex case with a slightly different presentation for their next recording. In terms of the complexity rating for this particular session provided from the scale authors, we've provided a rating of 3, somewhat complex. And this is because we felt the patient was relatively engaged and compliant, but the problem was somewhat severe and long-standing, and a relatively chronic and entrenched pattern of functioning seemed to be impacting on her daily life. Now that you've finished the numerical ratings, the qualitative feedback needs to be completed for the therapist. Now, this particular training session focuses on thinking about numerical values provided with the scale, but obviously the qualitative feedback forms a really crucial part of the formative learning process and is really where your skills and experience as an assessor and or supervisor really come to fruition. So within the feedback form, you will see that there's space to highlight key strengths and learning needs for each domain. And then also there's a skills profile at the end where you can just draw out the most important strengths and learning needs. So here it's particularly thinking about how the therapist can continue to build upon their strengths in the future, and what they need to do to further improve and develop perhaps those areas of somewhat weakness. So how could they further develop their skills in the future? Again, this may be the feedback may be written on this feedback form, but this may also form something which is discussed within, say, a supervision session. In terms of what we would be highlighting in the skills profile, we have a number of key strengths that we'd be noting. We felt that the therapist demonstrated a very good interpersonal style, coming across as very warm and empathic throughout the session. The therapist seemed to have developed a very strong therapeutic relationship with the patient. And given the limited time available, she really covered a lot of salient content and still managed to include suitable interventions. She also managed the limited time well and showed a really strong ability to both understand and to formulate this individual patient's idiosyncratic presentation. In terms of the therapist's learning needs, what we're highlighting here is firstly the need for a cross-session idiosyncratic measures of change to monitor ongoing progress. And we would perhaps be suggesting individually designed brief questionnaires that the patient completes for homework each week and then is briefly reviewed at the beginning of each session. When delivering interventions, we would note that the therapist could usefully take measures of belief or emotion or the target of the intervention in order to monitor impact of that intervention. We would also highlight the need to make sure that enough is being made of homework tasks. So in this session it seems like perhaps they could have added maintenance cycles or thought about different eating patterns to just really fully make the most of that homework task. Also noting the need to just be very explicit about checking out the rationale for interventions and homework tasks, and perhaps using the formulation to help the patient explore this rationale. And then finally considering allowing more time for that end of session work to make sure that setting up of homework and gaining patient feedback isn't something that is at all rushed. And perhaps you could spend a few moments just thinking about what qualitative feedback you would give the therapist. If you're working in groups, you could perhaps pair up and role play a therapist from the session and supervisor. Perhaps practice giving verbal formative feedback using the ACCS scale as your guide. And then finally, we'd just ask you to spend a moment reflecting on your experience of completing this training session. How did you find using the ACCS? What was your experience of giving feedback using this scale? What worked well and what didn't work so well when completing these ratings? What would you perhaps do differently next time that you complete a rating using this scale? And if you'd like to know more or have any questions, you can contact the lead author, myself, Kate Muse, at k.muse@walk.ac.uk. You can download a free copy of the ACCS scale and supporting documentation at www.accs-scale.co.uk. And you can read our research articles that we've published about this particular competence scale by looking at my profile on ResearchGate.